morning to you all. Welcome, dear colleagues, to NOVA-FCSH. I begin congratulating the organizers of this conference, which has its focus on very important issues, as we know. But first, let me tell you how proud and privileged I feel to have among us, not physically yet, such an inspiring personality as Albie Sachs. 2 days ago, last Wednesday, I felt very proud. I felt very proud for the deep, profound words pronounced on the speech of my dear colleague and friend, Teresa, Beleza, the Dean of the Faculty of Law of NOVA. I felt very proud listening to the speech of our rector, Professor João Saagua, a speech reflecting the values and the emotions of NOVA, our university. I felt really privileged to witness the speech of Albie Sachs. What an experience, what a life, what an example. 2 days ago, I felt very proud and privileged for being part of this university that shares these values and that has Albie Sachs as a member of its College of Doctors. Today, here at NOVA, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, we host this conference on globalization, motivated by the big question, where do we go from here? It is the mission of NOVA and of our school to raise and to think and discuss these issues: human rights, historical perspective, democracy and global security, and Earth system sustainability. Universities have the special role and responsibility on implementing and keeping this debate. This conference takes place on our school, also on the framework of our doctoral program on global studies, an innovative, updated, and interdisciplinary program which constantly raises the discussion of those important issues. It was recognized as one of the strategic lines of our school. The program is supported by the Foundation for Science and Technology and has been internationally evaluated by a panel of relevant specialists. NOVA and our school are well positioned to develop these studies through our research units and this prestigious and very well evaluated program. My last words consist on congratulating the organizers and the partnerships that made possible this scientific event, and to wish you have the following days of nice and fruitful debate. Enjoy the discussions. Enjoy Lisbon. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everybody. Welcome to Lisbon. Welcome to NOVA University and the Faculty of Social Human Sciences. I would like to address to you a few words this morning, but first I want to thank the invitation I got from Professor Margarida Marques to speak today, and also to Professor Diogo Ramada Curto, here present as one of for heading the doctoral program on globalization studies. And I would also like to tell you that I'm sort of here instead of the director of my research unit, which is IPRI, Portuguese Institute of International Relations. Nuno Severino Teixeira is away teaching abroad, actually is in Georgetown for this semester, so he can't be here, but nevertheless he sends you all his best regards and best wishes to all. But what I'd like to tell you today is that this conference is very important, and I think matters a lot for everybody here. It's very important to Nova University, for our faculty, as Francisco just explained, but also to our research unit, IPRI, and that is for a couple of reasons I would like to tell you about very quickly, of course. First of all, of course, is that IPRI is one of the hosts, is one of the institutions hosting the Globalization, the Globalization Studies doctoral program, of which many professors, graduate students, and researchers are here present or will be today, tomorrow, and this is so this is a very big thing for us. Secondly, IPRI develops research, scientific research, social scientific historical research, which, departing from the broad areas, broadly defined areas of political science and international relations, we research from a historically based perspective, usually comparative-based perspective, a multidisciplinary perspective. We are more worried with problems than with labels or strict labeling. And so I think that this outline, this very well thought, organized outline, is a perfect embodiment of the our IPRI's approach to social scientific research. In fact, human rights, history of empires, democracy and global studies, in global security, I'm sorry, and environmental sustainability are arguably at the core not only of what IPRI wants and aims to do well, of course, but at the vanguard of international research scientific agendas right now, if you're even paying off attention to what's going on in the academic community, international discourse, it's readily apparent these themes are perfectly at the core of what is being discussed today, and so this is very timely, again, well thought. But also, and thirdly, I think, this Congress is also important for us, for IPRI, for NOVA, and our faculty, because it embodies, in my view, perfectly what it means to develop a fully really based, internationalized research. Internalizations of the internationalization of research and researchers is an important topic, and this conference here today embodies what, in my view, is sort of what you should do. You should be able to present work, discuss with colleagues, both national and international, while giving graduate students and researchers an opportunity to get in the mix, to present their work, to discuss with seniors, and this is all very, very important for us to help us grow and be better, I think, today and in the future. So to conclude, we wish you all fruitful and creative work here at NOVA today, I think, tomorrow at National Library, close by. And so again, welcome and thank you very much.
So good morning. We, the PhD candidates, would like to open the human rights panel by trying to provoke a critical, wide and cross-sectoral dialogue. Most of us deal with human rights issues in our PhD research. So the following reflection is also deeply rooted in our different backgrounds, which comprise law, history, economy, and environmental engineering as well. In 1948, the United Nations proclaimed and presented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, aiming to protect human dignity in the world under a moral, legal, and political framework. Through the respect of individual and collective liberties, the Declaration of Human Rights promotes the idea of equality between human beings and the spirit of brotherhood. However, as pointed out by several authors, in order to achieve these ideals, collectives have to be acknowledged as relevant contexts of individuals. Rona Smith stated that customary international law has long recognized that some individuals deserved protection, often greater protection than that afforded to the nationals of a state. Existing studies show that since the Industrial Revolution, the wealth produced worldwide has skyrocketed, but so did the chasm between center and periphery. After the Declaration of Human Rights, many nation-states in the center have achieved high levels of human rights respect, thanks to which they managed to tame their internal levels of inequality until the early 1980s. Nevertheless, global inequality has remained high, even if declining in the new millennium, resulting in the degradation of the living conditions of millions of people on the planet. In many places of the world, people are still subject to forced labor or unacceptable working conditions. Access to education, health, sanitary conditions, and good quality environment are still missing or limited for millions of people in the world, caused by discrimination by origin, race, religion, language, gender, political ideology, or economic status. Despite world socioeconomic ups and downs since the Declaration of Human Rights, one must acknowledge that the number of people living in extreme poverty has decreased. Several authors claim that international organizations and their agencies have contributed to this trend, notably in Africa, through their targeted initiatives aimed to promote specific groups' human rights. But articulating human rights with non-Western cultures, establishing structures that guarantee the protection of human rights at local level has been a major challenge for the United Nations. And other authors emphasize the role of state policies in countries such as China, who thrived in spite of international organizations' pressures on the issue of human rights. One issue we want to further discuss is, can human rights, an invention of Western societies, really have a universal effect of correcting structural imbalances? Another issue has captured the interests of scholars. On the global level, interstate conflicts seem to take force in the 21st century with the emergence of powerful non-state actors such as terrorist groups and criminal organizations, many of them now considered global threats. In some states, generally weak states, the state's monopoly of violence is shared with these non-state organizations, resulting in cycles of violence, homicides, massacres, rapes, torture, inside and between communities. Any attempt to breaking down these cycles is generally achieved through the use of strong repression, which ends up in the violation of human rights as well. From Africa to Latin America and Asia, several examples can be found today. So, another issue we wish to debate is, how can countries such as Colombia, still facing the sequels of two major civil wars with weak states and institutions that have mitigated and fragmented ties with civil society, guarantee a sustainable commitment to human rights? Another topic under scrutiny concerns the fact that nation-states have to deal with growing and destabilizing flows of capital, goods, people, and information beyond its sovereignty scope. It could be argued that human rights are higher norms of behavior, encapsulated in the constitutional concept of the rule of law, and that they represent an expansion of the traditional concept of the rule of law. A Portuguese legal scholar, Castanheira Neves, advocates that only when the rule of law faces real crisis, as today, its concerns move from methodological problems to the full comprehension of what the juristic characteristics are, so-called big data, built and harvested through new communication technologies and giant transnational corporations, are a case in point. Transnational arrangements between states and other actors, such as TTIP, are another one. The rule of law has to find new ways to deal with new problems because the rule of law is more than rules, norms, or words. It is a social practice. And whenever it gets divorced from conforming force of reality, we are no longer in the presence of the rule of law. How should we address the dissemination and global impact of two competing legal cultures today, common law jurisdictions and civil legal systems? Is this relevant? And even inside each nation state, how to articulate public law dealing with social needs and private law concerned with the free play of market forces, without contributing to the polarization of the debate? And how can norms originated in the private realm of international arrangements between states and other actors coexist with the respect for democratic decisions? In fact, we know today that shared values and ideals represent a key factor for achieving social peace, because the rule of law also represents historically unique systems of shared understandings and ideals. As Brazilian philosopher Roberto Mangabeira Unger puts it, let us look at the controversial right to adequate housing. The governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher encouraged the transition from public housing provision to market delivery mechanisms. This policy, a privatized Keynesianism, as Wolfgang Strick calls it, believed in the idea of creating a better society built on the ethics of the market, and was replicated all around the Western world. Should we recognize globalization as convergence and the demise of the nation-state as a power actor? But what to do with all the losers of global mortgage capital, the modest income households, if effective redistributive measures are no longer available? Can international protection of human rights play a role here? Equality before the law, a right to property, and religious freedom seem to have been the starting point of human rights. Yet, home ownership, buying a house, is for so many now a risky decision which may end up in foreclosure. The right to expect rulers to be fair and reasonable, with limited authority in respect to private lives and property of their subjects, can be found in Magna Carta, year 1215, in England. But in 2017, it remains a challenge, because turning rights into realities is difficult. Human rights are binding obligations, but for many, they also depend on resources. An author advocates that rather than seeing law as a pragmatic set of rules for accomplishing policy goals determined in the light of the latest scientific understanding, what the law needed to develop is a robust framework of human rights, not subject to being overridden in the interests of some social policy or economic normativity. For we had just seen with Stalinism and Nazism where the disrespect of individual human rights had led. But Judge Albie Sachs once summarized the difficulty of balancing interests, also in South Africa, by questioning, could it be, though, that people want freedom without bread, or bread without freedom? Thank you.
So we'll start with my dear colleague Helena Pereira de Melo, who, among other many other things, was my supervisee when she decided to read for a PhD in discrimination in connection with genetics and law. She has now been my vice dean for about 9 years, and this explains a lot, because we have been running a school full of law professors for 9 years, which is about as hard as running a school full of professors of medicine, I think. I'm not sure about the comparison with social sciences and humanities, but anyway, it's a hard job. So Helena has been working very much on constitutional international law, but always connected with human rights in one way or another. She's also taught, like myself, in Venice, in the European European Master for Human Rights and Democratization, the so-called EUC Global Campus. It's now a network of about 100 universities all over the world, from Pretoria to Argentina somewhere, to Sarajevo, to Russia, to, anyway, such places. And it was created when the democratization of Eastern Europe started, and the European Commission found that they needed to educate some people to become professional people in human rights work. And it started with a small group of about 10 universities. From Portugal, Coimbra was there with my good friend Francisco Lucas Pires. He died a few years later. He was replaced by another good friend of mine, Vital Moreira, from the University of Coimbra. We've been working together for a long time, not just in Venice, but also in Coimbra in a course on human rights, postgraduate. And then Vital suggested to the person who started it all in Venice from Padua, Antonio Papisca, who died recently. He was the sort of great father of the founder of that institution. And it evolved into a network of 41 universities in Europe. So NOVA was the second university in Portugal to join. 2 universities per each European Union country are supposed to be in this network. Anyway, so Helena has been teaching there, particularly on bioethics, which is one of her main specialities. And she likes to deal with the future, so she will be talking to us on the rights of future generations. Helena, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here today with my supervisor, and we have, in fact, been ruling Faculty of Law for 9 years and a half. I think surviving it makes us, in a certain sense, future generations. And with Richard Zimler, whose books I'm reading at the moment, and I'm really, really adoring them. So it was a very happy moment being here today and being able to ask you several questions about the last book that I am reading. That is really very, very good. And with Virginia, that represents human rights and human rights in the United Nations, and a life fighting for us to have better human rights and our human rights fully respected. And I would like to say hello to everyone, especially to my PhD students, law students that have came, to Professor Eduardo Gonçalves, and to my recent friend since yesterday in Facebook, Doutora Maria Henriques. And so I'm going to speak about the rights of the future generations. I begin with a photograph of planet Earth. And I bring it because we are one of the first generations that is able to look at our planet from the outside. And this is something that is really beautiful and really astonishing, because we can think in a different way, everything. We can think in a different way. What is our place as human animals, as human beings in this planet, and how should law think about us? What would be the right legal status in the 21st century for us as human beings that might live in a certain place of this planet? It could be Portugal, it could be Spain, it could be Venice, and that might live at a certain time. It might be today, it might be in 1 million years. So we need a different type of law, a different approach a different way of looking at the human rights law, very different from what we have had in the past. And so, when we speak about future generations, the first issue that we have to solve is, will they exist? Because according to biology, 99.9% of the species that have existed have already disappeared. And this means that if we are not careful, or if North Korea goes on with their policies, probably in 5-10 years, or in 50 years, we will have no human animal on the picture that I have just shown you. And then we will have no problem at all. If we have no future generations, we will not have the problem of the rights of the future generations. But let us hope that they will exist, and let us hope that they will be similar to us. Because we have another issue, and the issue is, nowadays, we can change our species, and we can become a different species. We can live longer, we can be smarter, we can be more beautiful, we can be healthier. And we have all the issues linked with transhumanism. But let us think that in 1 million years we will be like this, and we will need to eat, we will need shelter, we will need family. The basic needs will be the same. And if we have the same basic needs today, and we will have the same basic needs in 1,000 years, how can we be sure that law is thought in a way that the rights of the people who are going to be born in 1 million years shall be respected? And that is something that is not easy. And the first thing that we have from a legal point of view is to define who are the future generations. Because we can speak about future generations in different ways. We can speak about future generations thinking about the children that are at school today. And you have the politicians saying, we are building schools for the future generations. We want the future generations to have access to health, to education, and so on. Or we can speak about the future generations as children that have already been conceived. And then we are speaking about pregnant women, or we are speaking about in vitro fertilized embryos that are frozen. Because we are one of the first generations that is able to freeze their offspring. We can freeze our embryos for 10, 20 years. We can produce embryos today and decide to freeze them and have a baby this year, another baby 2 years later, another baby 5 years later. And they are as well future generations. When from a biological point of view, they already exist. Or we can speak about future generations as people who are going to be born in 500 years, in 5 million years. And that is something very different from a legal point of view, as my law students very well know. And so, what we know for sure is that a generation is a certain period of time. We all know to which generation we belong. We all know that a generation is 20 to 25 years, and we know that there is a continuum of generations in the sense that people are always being born and are always dying. And at each moment we have 4 or 5 generations at the same time on planet Earth. And we have conflicts among these generations. If you think about social security law, you have the conflict between the very young people who have no access to employment and the very old people who are retired. But what you know is that you have 25 years one generation, 25 years another generation, 25 years another generation, and you have to decide when you speak about the rights of future generations, which is the generation that you are going to consider. And we can think that we can make a dot or put a dot when we are speaking about time in a certain moment. And that moment we shall call it T, the T moment. And it can be, for instance, 1,000 years from today. And we know that the people who are going to be born at that moment, we do not know if they are going to be born, we do not know how many they are going to be, but we know that they are, from a legal point of view, they are called concepturos. And this is a concept that comes from ancient Roman law. That means that we are speaking about people that have not yet been conceived, but we consider as probable that they will be conceived one day. And so, we have a new legal subject in international law, and that new legal subject is humanity. And we are going to consider as belonging to this new international subject past generations, present generations, and future generations. We are going to consider them as all the members of human species, as all human animals that have that exist, and that will exist. And this is something absolutely new in international human rights law, in the sense that we are working with an image, the image that I brought you, the image as Earth as a planet, as Earth as something that has no frontiers. Since frontiers are something that law has invented, has created, they do not exist. What the legal systems do is look at planet Earth and draw some lines, and we are going to consider the human being as a citizen of the world, not as a citizen of a state, but as a citizen of a planet. And so, what we know is that the future generations, in the sense that we have spoken about, will not have any type of relation with us, in the sense that we will not be able to sell them a car, in the sense that we will not be able to marry with them unless we are preserved by cold and someone will wake us up in 200 years and say, well, as the Sleepy Beauty, and say it's the moment that you are going to be again alive. But what we know is that they are potential victims of our actions. And I bring you a photograph of Hiroshima. And 70 years after, people are still being born with genetic mutations that are linked with the dropping of the bomb. They have had no relation with the person who has dropped the bomb, but they still have diseases and handicaps that are linked with an action that took place at that moment. And I bring you a part of the book that I'm finishing. And it is, as Richard may tell you, about the breaking of the glass, about World War II, about a moment when what was impossible became possible, and our values, our main values that we had in Europe, began to shatter, and evil began to take place, and the legal system was very much responsible for what happened. And we can think about the Nuremberg laws, and we can think about everything that made possible what is described. And so, the beginning of the future generations' rights is the end of World War II. And you have in the Charter of the United Nations the idea of one right of the first generations, of future generations, a right to peace, and the idea that you have to preserve future generations for all of what had happened before, and that you have to build an international community that will recognize them the right of not suffering again another war. So you have here the idea of the Second World War as the last war, the war that would end all wars. And you have it also in the Convention on Biological Diversity, as we are destroying biological diversity, namely through cloning, because cloning, as you know, means that the clones will have the same genetic constitution, and this means that they might be affected by the same viruses and the same bacteria, and this means that if all the clones die, a certain species will disappear. And we are doing it systematically with different types of animals, with different types of plants. And so you have the United Nations saying we have to preserve biological diversity for the future generations. And we have it with climate. And I bring you a photograph of the Ariel Sea. And this was in the 80s, and this is today. And this is what we are doing to our planet. And many people are going to die because they have either not enough water, either too much water, either it is too hot, either it is too cold. But we have, again, the idea of future generations and the idea that we have to preserve the climate for them. And we have biomedicine, because biomedicine allows us to change the structure of our species. And this means that through genetic engineering, through genetic enhancement, through gene therapy on germ lines, we will be able to have different children. Children who will be smarter, with better memory, who will be more resistant to disease, who will be more beautiful, who will be different from us, who will be enhanced. And so again, we have the idea that when we are using genetic, we have to think about the future generations, because they have not given their informed consent to it. We are choosing what they are going to be, and they haven't said we want to be like this. And so we have to respect their dignity. And we have a declaration, a UNESCO declaration, that is only about the responsibilities that we have towards future generations. And again, the idea of biodiversity, again, the idea of protecting the human genome. The human genome is something that is common to all of us. We, as members of the human species, have a certain DNA constitution, and that is something that links all of us, and that has to be respected by science and technology. And again, you have the same idea in one of the main declarations that we have in bioethics, UNESCO declarations. But you have it as well in what concerns digital heritage, in the sense that we are working less and less with paper. And this means that if there is a war, or if there is a computer breakdown, we will lose part of our culture. So it is important to have our memory, our digital memory, preserved somewhere and some way. Also with cultural heritage, and I bring you a photograph, a last week photograph of Syria, that tells us what we are doing for the future generations. We are destroying, in certain countries, we are destroying everything, and this means that they will not have access to things that are very important to us from a cultural point of view, and again, in what concerns the global climate. So, we are speaking about rights of our species as such. We are speaking about rights. That means that we have to be, that we have solidarity not towards the person who is next to me, not towards the people who live in Lisbon, who live in Portugal, who live in Europe, who live near us, but towards the people who live all over the planet, and that will live at a certain moment of time. We are speaking about being concerned with people whom we will never have any type of relation with whom, and who we will never know. And these rights are collective rights. This means that they can only be exercised by a group of people, as law students know very well, and it means that only humanity can say, we have this right. We want this right to be fully respected. And you find it, for instance, in the Universal Declaration of Human Genome and Human Rights, the idea that as we all have the same genome, and this is something that is characteristic, specific of our species, in the sense that all the other species have a different genome, that makes us members of the same family, that links us. And that means that we have to respect each other, and that we have to respect the dignity of each other. And in a symbolic sense, we consider it as heritage of humanity. And one of the main concepts that we have when we are speaking about future generations' rights is this concept of heritage of humanity. And we use it with the human genome, we use it with the moon, we use it with the high sea, and it means that we can use this type of assets only in the interest of the entire humanity. We can use it only for peaceful ends, and we cannot use more than a certain part of it. Each generation has to respect the rights of the next generations to have access to it as well. So, which are the rights that humanity has? We have the right to benefit from the world's common heritage, and this means that we are going to apply this right to different realities. We might apply it to a beautiful monument, but we may apply it to a beautiful book, we may apply it to the human genome and so on. We have the right to peace as one of the fundamental rights that the future generations need to be respected, because without peace it's not possible to have life with dignity. We have the right to water, in the sense that the right to safe and adequate water is less and less respected in many countries, in a great part of the world. And we have the right to breathe pure air. And you have to think about nanotechnology, and you have to think about the cars that we have outside of this building and all the pollution that they bring that is slowly killing us. For instance, in our country, cancer is the second cause of death. But we have again another issue. Who is going to represent the future generations? Future generations do not vote. They have no lobby. So this means that many times people who have been elected tend to say, we are not going to consider them. There is no direct advantage for us to consider in our decisions the rights and the interests of people who have not yet been born. And here you have an example from the United States of America, where a person who is very much who has a very good place in an agency that is linked with the environment says, this air is too clean. And so we should not sign the conventions that are linked with fighting pollution. So we should not try to stop pollution, making enterprises pay more when they are polluting. So one way of defending the rights of future generations is, as it was proposed by UNESCO, to create a guardian for the future, a tutor for posterity, that when you are adopting a certain type of convention or treaty, will say, be careful, this has an impact for the rights of the future generations. Do not do it. Do not destroy the forest in Brazil, because if you are destroying it, future generations will not have pure air. Be careful with what you are doing, because it will have serious implications. And so I'm going to end here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Helena, for this great presentation. I think you give us a lot of food for thought, and it ties very nicely with what Virginia will be talking about. She has a wonderful title. Her presentation, I'm sorry. She also has a wonderful title, by the way. She's now the chair of the UN Committee for Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. I always get the other wrong. It's economic, social. I know. Thank you. Sorry. So, Virginia has been working on these particular rights for a long time. She's one of the great world experts in that area. She has, just like Helena, by the way, I forgot to mention this, they both have been, they both have taught some of the students of this PhD program on some occasions. You, Helena, and you, Virginia, have come on some occasions to talk to the PhD students and also to the master students on gender studies or whatever it's called. Anyway, so Virginia suggested the transformative power of economic, social, and cultural rights in war and peace. I said it right. And I think that partly by coincidence, the three people who are sitting here at the moment, apart from me, Albie, who's just arrived and will speak last, do have a lot in common, in the sense that not only are they all committed to human rights, which would be obvious since the general topic of the panel is human rights, but they are concerned and involved in their professional, personal lives in a very in different ways, but in a very committed sort of way, and I think that makes them all, in different ways, very special people. Virginia is, among other things, an extremely resilient person. I envy that, I must confess. There are a few people in Portugal that when they were little, they fell into the soup of Obelix. You know, Obelix had this big thing with soup with special strength. So, the President of the Republic, Virginia, my elder sister, and a few other people fell into that soup when they were little. And I envy them horribly because they can fly to India. She's flying to India tomorrow. My sister was flying to India last week. And every time I have to fly to Venice, I get tired because the plane is taking off. I'm sorry, but you know, it's true. She is, among other things, a brilliantly resilient person, both in physical and intellectual terms. And so I'm very happy to have her here with us today. And go ahead with your wonderful topic.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, really, and I'm really glad for this invitation. I would like to thank Universidad Nova for this opportunity to be at this panel with people I deeply respect because of their commitment to human rights, to human dignity, to gender equality. And I'm really privileged. I'm not an academic. I work in social security, have done that for a long time. I work in public policy, have done that for a long time. And therefore, I hope you will forgive me for this somewhat pompous title of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in War and Peace. But I hope to make my case in these 20 minutes. My connection to Richard Zimler is of a little different nature. He has written a beautiful book called Goa, the Guardian of the Dawn. And believe me, he has a reference in the book to Banauli, which is the little village where I was born and grew up. And that is really something that touched me profoundly, to find a writer, a universally acclaimed writer like Zimler, talk about Banauli and what an enormous joy it was for Tiag Zark, that is the hero of Goa, the Guardian of the Dawn, to have arrived in Banauli. So Richard, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you too. Notwithstanding the indivisibility and the interdependence of all human rights, my focus today, as Teresa said, will be on how the fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights is essential for sustainable peace in a globalized world. And I underline sustainable, and I underline peace in its wider holistic sense, and not only as a period of absence of conflict. My point of departure is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which I am partial to it. I do confess, but I think it's one of the most beautiful core human rights treaties. I stand to be challenged and to be corrected, but this is my understanding of all the 9 core human rights treaties. I really think the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is an extremely relevant and well-written treaty. And what I would like to focus on is how non-compliance on the part of states with the obligations to realize rights in enshrined in the covenant for the present generations, and that is my claim for today, how it impacts pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict situations, not only in the transitional justice process, but beyond as well. In our experience in the community, one of the recurrent threats we witness to peace is in relation to the right to an adequate standard of living. I know one of the colleagues who opened this panel, she spoke of the right to housing. That is also under an adequate standard of living. And I think we will have some time in the evening for a discussion. And I would like to come back to one of the issues you raised, which is that human rights is the invention of Western democracies. I do not agree with that, really. And we can discuss it later in the evening. I hope we find the time for that. So one of the areas where we find these threats is in relation to the denial of access, ownership, and use of land, and the impact of this denial on correlated rights: food, housing, water and sanitation, livelihoods, and also perhaps, in my opinion, most relevantly, the right to a cultural identity. In many parts of the world, the right to feed oneself and one's family is inextricably linked to land and agriculture production. But global development trends seem to run counter to this understanding. In fact, as we see every day on TV and in the newspapers, many small farmers have been confronted with the loss of fertile agricultural land that had not originally been assigned for industrial purposes, but under the guise of development and economic investment, it is used for the establishment of special economic zones or free trade zones, or for biofuel production or large-scale farming, not to mention unfair trade policies and the ever-growing threats posed by climate change and environmental degradation, of which we saw some pretty horrifying pictures. So underlying these negative factors and very much contributing to undercurrents of tension and hostility are discrimination patterns, whether obvious or socially ingrained, that place women and traditionally discriminated groups even worse off when it comes to access, own, use, or otherwise control land and property on an equal basis, and to access the necessary resources to do so. Looking at the link between land and housing, many families remain without formal ownership or registration title over their homes and land for generations. And this has led to cases and leads to cases of arbitrary property confiscation without access to an adequate remedy or restitution of their property or compensation. These are all well-documented human rights violations. However, public authorities continue to close their eyes in the best case, or are themselves involved in human rights violations that affect specific groups. Let me give you a couple of examples. Forced eviction in the name of mega development and infrastructure projects such as the construction of dams and other large-scale energy projects carried out in conflict over land rights is one such example. Land acquisition measures associated with urban renewal, with what is now called beautification programs, under eminent domain or compulsory purchase legislation is another example. The permanent or temporary removal against their will of individuals, families, and communities from their homes and lands which they occupied, which is carried out in most cases without guarantee of appropriate forms of legal and other protection, is yet another example. And experience has shown over and over again that this is the right breeding ground for conflict. Appropriate procedural protection and due process, including opportunities for genuine consultation and measures of reparations, are practically not in place. An issue that's gaining growing relevance in the globalized world is that of state obligations vis-a-vis the business sector. How do states interpret and fulfill the obligation to protect individuals and families against violations by non-state actors? How do they address the far-reaching efforts of activities of corporate enterprises on the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights at home and abroad? States are not complying with their duty to protect against violations by third parties. If they were, mineral extraction, land grabbing, and large-scale development projects would not be carried out without any meaningful consultation and protection of the right to land, natural resources, and livelihoods of indigenous groups and local communities. And there would be effective grievance mechanisms that are accessible and affordable in place. That is not happening. What is far more disturbing is that public authorities often close their eyes to acts of intimidation, harassment, and killings of land rights and environmental activists, with perpetrators going unpunished. There are so many known cases of deaths of human rights defenders. I think Albie is one living example where this does not happen but could have happened. More recently, people like Berta Cáceres, the Honduran environmental activist, the indigenous leader of a people who opposed a dam project on a river sacred to the indigenous Lenca people and was killed in March 2016, is a closer example to us. Conflicts, they can and they do occur in countries at various levels of development with different political and governance systems and demographics of the population. There's clearly no one-size-fits-all model that allows us to predict with certainty where and when unrest and conflict will erupt in the absence of preventive measures. Yet, there may be some core elements, particularly regarding economic, social, and cultural rights, that could be identified as part of an early warning system. Active discrimination and stigmatization of a particular group or groups is among these core elements. But discrimination is not only about suppression of freedoms for certain groups, however dangerous that may be. If there are particular dimensions of accessibility and availability or acceptability of goods and service indispensable for the fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights that are not available to all on an equal basis, that may be equally or even more dangerous. We have the example of various countries during the Arab Spring, for example, where the underlying causes for the conflict were deeply related to violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. There is ample evidence that denial of violations of economic, social, and cultural rights stem from unequal power distribution, discrimination, and inequality. They can serve as red flags to alert states and other actors to escalating tensions and conflict. In fact, there is increasing evidence that violations of economic, social, and cultural rights are causes, consequences, and often even predictors of social unrest and conflict. Up to now, I've considered peace in its restricted traditional meaning of a period of freedom from public disturbance or conflict. But there's a more holistic concept of peace, characterized by social justice, respect for law, goodwill, inclusion, and reconciliation of interests of different groups, along the lines of an overarching social contract. First of all, during the time of transitional justice, in which a society moves from conflict, unrest, and oppression into a space of non-conflict governed by the rule of law and human rights. It is the time for social, economic, and emotional reconstruction and for peace building by pursuing a set of goals and putting in place the legal and policy measures to accomplish them. Analysis of different conflicts and peace processes all over the world point to root causes such as gender inequality, militarism, violence, and the political economy of war that are as interlinked as they are entrenched in the international system. Conflict resolution has been dictated by a binary narrative of bringing together the factions at war, mainly men, despite the evidence that the active presence of women throughout the peace-building process is the one powerful factor in sustaining peace. In post-conflict states, transitional justice is often hampered by the forces of the free market combined with austerity, which is particularly damaging when and where the support of the international community is crucial. Civil and political rights may be included in peace agreements, but there's scarce mention of economic, social, and cultural rights, probably because they're still considered subsidiary to fundamental rights and freedoms, to be fulfilled by policies based exclusively on availability of resources and therefore subject to future economic development and approval of the international financial institutions and donor countries. Given that in many donor countries, economic, social, and cultural rights are considered as policies, or in the best case as benefits, but seldom as entitlements that entail state obligations, it's easy to understand why they're not part of peace agreements. Let me reiterate that the inclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights in any post-conflict new constitution is vital to make them justiciable and render them effective to peace-building processes. Fortunately, against the artificial division of human rights into first-class rights that ensure the freedoms and second-class rights that are mostly aspirational, there is jurisprudence of many constitutional courts, for which, for example, the South African Constitutional Court, to which Albie Sachs has contributed enormously, that prove that human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent, and therefore justiciable. We hope the optional protocol to the covenant, building on the decisions national and regional complaint mechanisms have taken, will provide further jurisprudence. Bottom line, without the empowerment provided by equal access to and enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, there can be no meaningful social or transitional justice. They are essential if transitional justice is to become transformative justice and therefore long-lasting justice. Closer to us, the understanding of peace as an overarching social contract is being negatively impacted by a contemporary phenomenon that can and has already unleashed tensions leading to social unrest, alienation, and disenfranchisement. That is the whole issue of austerity and fiscal adjustment. As early as 1988, in a statement of globalization and economic, social, and cultural rights, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights alerted to the fact that if trends, policies, and consequences of globalization were not complemented by appropriate additional policies, globalization risked downgrading the central place accorded to human rights by the International Bill of Human Rights. It added the statement that competitiveness, efficiency, and economic rationalism must not be the primary or exclusive criteria against which governmental and intergovernmental policies are evaluated. 20 years later, against the backdrop of globalization, social and economic inequalities have grown, and new risk groups with little or no access to resources, goods, and services indispensable for the realization of economic and social rights are faced with social exclusion. As I think Teresa read out in the beginning, or if she did not read it out, it's written in the program, globalization provided the space for new demands of universalism and freedom of movement for individuals, goods, and ideas. For these demands to be successful, universality and indivisibility of human rights is an essential requirement. It is not true. It did not happen. As early as in 2004, the World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization stated that seen, and I quote, through the eyes of the vast majority of men and women around the world, globalization has not met their simple aspiration for decent jobs, livelihoods, and a better future for their children. This remains true in part because at the international level, the gap between and within countries has widened, basically because making use of the opportunities provided by globalization requires material, technological, and organizational capacities that are unevenly distributed. Furthermore, social development policies have been mistakenly considered as being contrary to economic growth and international competitiveness, and establishment of social safety nets absolutely necessary to cushion the unwanted or unexpected effects of globalization have not been considered a national political priority. In the post-austerity so-called economic recovery period, generally speaking, progressive realization of economic, social and cultural rights has come to a kind of a standstill across the board, which is not the environment conducive to sustainable peace as the overarching social contract. Let me use my final minutes for a couple of messages. The meaningful participation of rights holders is an essential human rights standard. Participation, particularly in times of adversity, means inclusive democratic processes that reinforce and empower women and men and help them deal with the consequences of powerlessness. Open, participatory, and meaningful dialogue, not just window dressing, with communities affected by tension and conflicts, is not only a means to ensure their voices are heard and their rights respected, but also an important policy tool that can offer a range of practical measures to prevent conflict and build more cohesive societies. A reason for great concern is that in the developed and developing worlds alike, the space for civil society organizations, human rights defenders is shrinking. Increasingly stringent regulations for their registration, funding, and functioning are symptoms of a deeper misperception of what public governance, accountability, and transparency mean, and that is not a good omen. Effective fulfillment of all human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, is fundamental to prevent unrest, violence, and conflict, and to design and implement sound and coherent economic and social policies at all times, whether in war or in peace. States have legal, political, and moral responsibilities towards their people, in particular those most in need of protection. It has never been better said than by the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, and I quote, "I am not suggesting that human rights will provide a solution to massive and complex challenges, but human rights can and must be the compass that provides the moral ethical and legal guidance to effective responses at every level. While the common theme underlying experience of deprivation is one of powerlessness, human rights can empower individuals and communities. The challenge is to connect the powerless with the empowering potential of human rights. This is the end of the quote, and I would add, in war and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for calling our attention again to the importance of the economic, social, and cultural rights and the real legal strength of so many obligations under international law. Sometimes we tend to think that there are some real rights, like right to life and like right to freedom or whatever, and then there are these sort of second-rate, second-hand, second something or other rights, and that's certainly something that is not only obsolete as a way of thinking, but it's against that idea that the work of people like Virginia has been so important, and we do hope to convince the rest of humankind, because we are very modest people, so we tend to. I'm not crazy, I'm just tired. So, yesterday Albie was at the law school in one of the many conferences that are happening this week, and he quoted an English legal saying, possession is nine points of the law, and he said that he had changed that into dispossession is 9 points of the law. And that's partly what Helena and Virginia have been talking about, and certainly what Richard will talk about. He's giving us a talk, and the theme or the topic, speaking for the silenced, and that is in fact what Richard has been doing in his various wonderful books. I'm not sure whether the one that Helena said she's just reading is one that I lent to her a couple of weeks ago. It is certainly one of my favorites, The Seventh Gate, because it deals with maybe one of the last taboos in discrimination and silenced, invisible, vulnerable people. But he has, like Virginia also mentioned, many other wonderful books, like The Guardian of the Dawn, the one that has quite understandably touched you so much. I also very much enjoyed Looking for Sana. I tend to, sometimes I call her Sarah, but she's Sana. Okay, like the hotel where I'll be staying, yes. The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon is probably one of the best known, I think, in Portugal, for more or less obvious reasons. And as far as I understand, it was probably one of the episodes that somehow made Richard realize that he could write about not just people, but episodes that were forgotten in history, and in that way he could also contribute for raising awareness of human rights, or the lack thereof. But other important titles or popular titles are Hunting Midnight, the Warsaw Anagrams, and so on. And I'm really happy that he can be with us here today, because although there is, well, I was going to say one lawyer, two lawyers, three lawyers. Well, Albie is a lawyer, among other things.
I'm not.
Virginia's not a lawyer. But we do have a writer, which is, we have various writers, but one sitting at the table. And Richard, please do tell us why you decided to speak for the silence. And thank you for being here.
Good morning to everybody. I hope the microphone's okay. First, thanks to Teresa and the other organizers for the invitation. I've never been on a panel where everybody has been so kind and generous to me, so I feel a little embarrassed. Thanks to Virginia and thanks to Helena for being so kind about my books and mentioning them. They've made my week. I'm very grateful. It's also thrilled to be on a panel with people who are fighting so hard in their work for human rights. Helena, in her talk, when she mentioned that 99.9% of the species on the planet have already disappeared, reminded me that when I watched the news from America, where I was born and grew up, I start to believe that intelligent life is already on the way out as well. So I'm a little nervous about that. And hearing Virginia's talk about, which she mentioned, empowerment of women, it reminded me that a few weeks ago, I gave a talk for American students visiting Portugal from Kansas City. And the person who spoke before me was the former Minister of Health. And one student asked the former Minister of Health, hey, I've heard that the birth rate in Portugal is really low, which is true. How are we going to get that birth rate back up? And the minister gave this really complex answer, which was probably correct. I know nothing about the subject, about giving parents more leave of absence and how hospitals can better treat pregnant women and all sorts of things. And then when I got on, to be a little provocative, I said, well, if we really want women in Portugal to have more babies, the answer is extremely simple, because all the studies show that women who have very little or no education have a lot of children. So all we need to do is give women less education in Portugal. And I mention that because it's funny, but also because we really need to decide what we want. Do we want women to be educated, to have options in life, to be able to choose what they want to do, or do we want a very high birth rate? So we really need to think about these issues before we start suggesting solutions and what we really want. I'd like to start by talking about a human rights issue that we tend to forget, but that's absolutely essential, and that has been important to my writing. So what's this issue that we tend to forget? I call it the right to exist. I realize that may sound strange, but let me explain. Until the 1960s and 1970s, virtually all the historical texts were written from the point of view of those who won the wars and the elections. Almost all of them were written, in fact, to favor the political goals of dictators, presidents, or prime ministers of governments. Since I live in Portugal, I tend to use examples from here, but today I'd like to use an example from the United States. I'd like to talk about the history of the colonization of America for just a moment. Even in New York State, where I grew up, where the Mohawks and Iroquois had their territory, we never discussed Native Americans. Never. Not once in my junior high or high school did we talk about their culture, religion, music, or history. Nothing. All we got in America were the terrible images of Native Americans provided by the films of John Ford and other highly commendable directors. The merciless, savage, traitorous beings always out to kill the American European colonists. We had a lot of what I call Hollywood Indians, but no real Native Americans. And perhaps that's still the case in American schools, where we don't talk about that part of our history. Now, without the right to exist, you simply vanish. Your story, how you lived, what you thought about, what you desired and what you feared is never told. And so this becomes a moral issue. Do all living beings have the right to exist? Because making someone invisible seems to me a crime against humanity. Indeed, is there any condition less equal than simply not existing? This profound truth about how people vanish from history became an important part of my life when I was researching my first novel. It's called The Last Cabalist of Lisbon. Here's the Portuguese edition. So I want to talk about what it taught me about human rights and how it helped me understand what I wanted to do in my life and my writing. It was originally published in 1996 in Portuguese, although I wrote it in English. I had the idea for the book in 1989. I was visiting my parents' house in suburban Long Island, just outside New York City, and my mom was a great reader. I grew up basically in a library. And in the room where she kept art books and biographies, mostly of the Bloomsbury Group, I found a book about Jewish manuscript illumination. I'm Jewish, but I grew up in a secular household, so I knew very little about religious Judaism. And I didn't know anything about manuscript illumination. So I opened the book and I discovered that Jewish artists throughout the diaspora, in other words, in Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, all over the world, had created wonderful illustrations for Bibles, prayer books, and other sacred texts in Judaism. And this blew me away, and these illustrations were incredibly beautiful and had mythological beings, men with parrot heads, and I just didn't know anything about this tradition, so I read the book. And so I decided to write a book about a manuscript illuminator living here in Lisbon prior to the Inquisition. It had to be before the Inquisition because King Manuel I confiscated all Jewish Hebrew books. So I started to do the research. I was already living here, and I discovered the Lisbon Massacre of 1506. In April of 1506, during secret Passover celebrations, in other words, the Jews were celebrating the Exodus in secret because you couldn't be openly Jewish in Portugal, 2,000 converted Jews, new Christians, Marranos, conversos, were taken from their homes and murdered and burnt in the main square of Lisbon, in the Rocio. You've probably already been to the Rocio. And the reasons for this are many. Historians discuss the fact that the population was crazed because of plague and drought. We know even specific details about what happened from contemporaneous accounts. For instance, we know that northern sailors paid for the wood to burn their bodies. It would never have occurred to me that someone would need to pay for the wood to burn their bodies, but these are the details that a novelist like to have, of course. And so then I started asking my friends, and I have friends who, of course, are jurists and doctors and full professors, and I asked them, well, what do you know about the Lisbon Massacre of 1506? And they all said to me, what massacre? No one knew anything about it. And it just so happens that I have an extremely subversive personality. When I find out that people would like to whitewash or forget a crime against humanity, whether it's in Portugal or America or anywhere else, that becomes something I love to talk about. It gives me great pleasure to talk about what people with power, economic and political power, would prefer to forget. And of course, it's a very important issue, acknowledging and exploring crimes against humanity. Of course, talking about subjects that other people would prefer to forget can get us into trouble. We can be accused of treason or defamation. At the very least, people will resent our insistence on speaking of matters that they consider taboo, or they'll think we're simply crazy. Especially because we probably won't be very successful and make money. And these days, making money is what's important, and if you don't want to make that much money, you must be crazy. Whatever they decide about us, they probably won't support our project, so it's a risk. It took me 1 year to research the last cabals to Lisbon and 2 years to write, and then it was rejected by 24 American publishers. All the most famous American publishers, Doubleday, Knopf, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, they all rejected my book. They all virtually said, oh, it's really well written, it's amazing, dramatic time, fantastic characters, but it's not going to sell. The problem in America, for those of you who visited my home country, was largely geographic. For Americans, the world begins in Florida and Maine and ends in California, and all the rest of the universe simply does not exist. It would have been better if I'd written science fiction, because at least Mars and Venus would have appeared on their radar. Lisbon in 1506 was way off their radar. I want to add that this holds more for literary editors and publishers than for the public themselves. Okay. So I had the crazy idea of showing the book to a Portuguese publisher, which is also proof that sometimes the craziest of our ideas can save our lives. So I was very naive. I knew nothing about Portuguese publishing, so I asked the names of publishers from a couple of friends of mine, and they gave me a list, and the name in common was Maria de Piedade Pereira, who ran a very nice little publishing house called Quetzal at the time. And so I spoke to her in my very bad Portuguese at the time and explained the book, and she said, "Oh, well, send me the manuscript." So after 3 months, I hadn't heard anything from Maria de Piedade, and I called her up, and she said, "Well, why don't you come to Lisbon and we'll talk about it?" And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to take the train from Porto, where I normally live, to Lisbon, 2 hours and 40 minutes. And just so she can tell me it's a really well-written book, fascinating characters, dramatic time, but it isn't going to sell. I'll make this long story very short. The first thing I said when I reached her office here in the Bairro Alto, the first thing she said was, "What would you like on the cover?" And I thought, well, I've misunderstood her, because my Portuguese was very bad at the time. And I said, you know, I really don't understand. So she said, well, do you have an image, an idea for the cover? We were speaking Portuguese, so a capa, the cover of the book. And I said, well, does that mean you want to publish it? And she said, yeah, we loved it. So I remember absolutely nothing about the rest of our conversation, because I was in total ecstasy. But I really don't want to talk more about the success of the book. I want to talk about what it taught me. That I like to write about people who have disappeared from the official histories of our country and others. The people who've lost the wars and lost the elections, lost the fight for equality, lost their territories and countries, lost the right to exist. Said another way, the presidents and prime ministers of the world, they don't need me. They have all the propagandists they could ever need writing history from their point of view. Yes, many current Russian history books undoubtedly treat that wretched dictator, Vladimir Putin, as if he were a brilliant statesman. To make this even clearer, imagine if Hitler had won World War II. Imagine all the wonderful German history books that would praise him. The leaders of the world, the men and women with power and riches, do not need me or other novelists. The outsiders need me, the people whose voices have been stolen. And that's why historical fiction is very important. In the case of The Last Cabalist of Lisbon, I explore a dramatic and tragic moment in the history of the Portuguese Jews. Other books I've written also explore the lives of those who vanished or been treated as a taboo. In The Seventh Gate, which was mentioned here, I write about a crime against humanity that still people do not want to talk about. Sorry, I'm not Bruce Springsteen. I don't know how to use microphones. The crime against humanity is the war on disabled people. Right away in 1933, Hitler started sterilizing people who were blind and deaf and who had epilepsy and facial deformations. And in 1939, he started killing them. And this happened, sterilization happened in the United States, in Sweden, and many other countries. So what I have found by writing that book is that it's still okay to discriminate against disabled people in many countries. How many buildings in Portugal even have ramps, for instance, so people in wheelchairs can get through them? In Guardian of the Dawn, I write about how the Portuguese exported the Inquisition to its colonies in India, to Goa. And the Inquisition in Goa, most people in Portugal don't know, lasted all the way from 1560 to 1812. That's not so long ago. Thousands of people in Goa were put in prisons for 3, 4, 5 years, tortured, and then burnt. When I wrote Guardian of the Dawn, I discovered that there are also, just like there are Holocaust deniers, there are people who deny that the Inquisition occurred. And for the first time in my life, I received hate mail, which is an interesting experience for a writer, and not one I would recommend. In the Warsaw Anagrams, I write about daily life in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the Night Watchman, I write about abused kids and how the legacy of violence can suffer and haunt them and their families for decades and sometimes forever. And in Hunting Midnight, the other book I brought along with me because I'd like to give it to Albie, even if he doesn't want it, I write about a bushman, a sand healer, who comes to Europe to live with a secret Jewish family in Portugal in the 19th century. And I wrote it because I was fascinated when I started reading about Bushman culture and mythology, and when I discovered that they are considered by geneticists to be the oldest people on Earth. In other words, the Bushmen separated from their nearest cousins a long, long time ago. Said in a way that's a bit provocative, a Jewish white American has more in common genetically with a person from China than a sand person, a bushman, has with their nearest neighbors. And that just blew my mind, because the stories they told, their mythology, are the oldest stories on earth. And when I discovered that they were being decimated and disappearing and their culture was being trampled, I thought, we've got to preserve these stories. And I'm asked often to speak in front of Jewish audiences, and as I said, I like to be subversive. So when I talk to the Jewish audiences, I sometimes say that, in other words, Adam and Eve were bushmen. And that sort of gets a reaction, but it's really, that is what I really believe and what the genetic studies tend to prove. And so I knew I had to do something, and the result was Hunting Midnight. It gives me a great sense of accomplishment to tell the stories of oppressed or forgotten people from their perspective. And if novelists won't do it, who will? I'd like to add that you don't need to be a writer to become part of this project. Everyone, regardless of their profession, can participate. Economists, doctors, artists, carpenters, musicians, psychologists, or legal and constitutional experts like Albie, Sachs, of course, who began participating in this project decades before me, and in a much more risky and courageous way. I'd like to now speak to the younger people in the audience. We have a few students for just a brief moment. The people who've yet to choose a direction in their life, because you can participate in this project as well. If you become a doctor, for instance, it might mean working with a program like Doctors Without Borders and treating people in underdeveloped countries. If you become a researcher in law or anthropology or psychology, it might mean working with and studying ethnic groups like the Rohingya, who are being systematically persecuted and murdered. No matter who you are, there is always something you can do for the people whose voices have been silenced over the world and in your own country. It might mean giving up a big salary for a few years, and it might mean having to live in a faraway place. But I'm pretty sure the benefits you get, the amazing experiences you will have, will change you forever and make you a far richer and more understanding person. But where do you get the inspiration to do something different? So I'd like to end my talk very briefly by talking about inspiration for a few minutes. When I was a kid, I played a lot of sports, and my favorite sport was basketball. And when the basketball teacher, the coach, the gym teacher would say, you know what, it's time to get on the court and play some basketball, I didn't need any inspiration because I loved playing basketball. So in part, finding inspiration means finding what gives what your passion is, what your bliss is. But then when you go out and you play basketball, it was basketball for me, it might be soccer or ballet or music for somebody else, you become inspired by your own capacities. When I would make a great shot or a great pass or get a good rebound, I became inspired by how well my body worked, how I could play basketball. And that gave me the idea that life is really a system of feedback. We get inspiration from what we do. Basketball isn't theory, although there's theory involved. Basketball is doing, just like music or any other activity we love, and like human rights. So, working with wonderful people who desperately need your help, curing children suffering with diseases that no longer exist in Europe and America, helping poor families put electricity in their homes for the first time, researching a crime against humanity and exposing it in the media, doing things that change people's lives for the better, that give them a chance to fulfill their dreams or get justice. I'm absolutely certain that that will give you all the inspiration you need. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Something about Albie Sachs, and I now have the honor of having him with me again. We've known each other for 40-something years, and it's very easy and very difficult to describe him. He's a hero of the resistance against apartheid. He's a retired judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. He is one of the main authors of the South African Constitution. He is a brilliant speaker, a wonderful writer, a great friend, an eminent lawyer and constitutionalist, and I think I'll let you go on with the list because it will become so obvious if it isn't already for the ones who are happy enough to know your work or something about your life. Albie chose as a theme globalization versus universalism, and that is what we'll be listening to you speaking about. Please, Albie. Welcome.
It seems that the main criterion for being invited by Teresa to come to Lisbon is to be a provocateur. And I'm going to follow in the tradition of my colleague on the right. It's a little easier for me in South Africa to provoke, but I think the provocation can move from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. I ask two questions. The one is, what is the one good thing that apartheid produced? And that certainly gets a South African audience to sit up. And I think it's even put you on the alert. The other is, can you remember what you did on the 6th of April 1952? And I never get an answer. I'm getting used to being the oldest person in the room, by far. But it's a nice beginning. 6th of April 1952, I'm a 17-year-old second-year law student. I'm in the Salt River Town Hall in Cape Town. Not much bigger than this room, not nearly as fancy as this room. There are about 190 black people, maybe 10 white people. That date is important. On the 6th of April, 1652, a certain Dutch naval commander, Jan van Riebeeck, landed in Cape Town. He planted the Dutch East India Company flag there, and we learnt at school that was when civilization started in southern Africa. And this is now the 300th anniversary of that date, and the Nationalist Party that had won the elections in 1948 are celebrating 300 years. They were the ones who coined the word apartheid, gave the word apartheid to the English language, and they are celebrating. The aeroplanes are flying overhead, the armored cars are going through the streets, the schools are closed, it's a public holiday, and we are in this 200 people in this little hall, and we are singing. The songs in those days of the resistance would be very sad. My boye, my boye, my boye, Africa, come back Africa. Senzenina, 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 senzenina. What have we done, what have we done, what have we done to deserve this? And suddenly, volunteers obey the orders, volunteers obey the orders, volunteers obey the orders, be ready for the action now. Dr. Maroka, Dr. Dadu, J.B. Marks, Katani Leba Papi, volunteers obey the orders, be ready for the action now. And the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign is starting. And there are just maybe 200 of us in this room. The planes flying overhead, the armored cars going through the streets. And we are going to defy unjust laws. And the unjust laws were laws that compelled every black man to carry a document, a pass, which the police could demand from him any time of day or night, in his home, in the streets. The laws that said black people couldn't move without permissions from white authorities. The laws that said the buses were for whites only, even bridges you could cross for whites only, the beaches, the cinemas. The laws that said black people after a certain hour at night couldn't be out on the streets without a permit after a siren had gone. 6 laws were chosen. And they're calling for volunteers. And I say to my friend who brought me there, Wolfie Kodesh, I want to volunteer. Volunteers, I want to be a volunteer. He says, you can't. I say, why? He says, because you're white. I say, but we're fighting racism. He says, no, it's a black struggle led by black people. But I will mention it to the leaders. And 6 months later, after I've written my second year exams, we timed it quite well. End of the year, summer vacation starting, I'm leading a small group, 4 of us white people sitting on benches marked non-whites only. Now what's that got to do with globalization, universalization? What's that got to do with the one good thing that apartheid did? Volunteer number 8,942 or something was Albie Sachs. Volunteer number 1 was Nelson Mandela, a not very well-known lawyer who was going to give up the little bit that he could get from being a qualified lawyer. He couldn't vote, he couldn't be out in the streets, he couldn't sit on a bus, but he could make some money as a lawyer, and now he was going to sacrifice that for the sake of the freedom of black people in South Africa. The one good thing that apartheid did was to create anti-apartheid. It enabled Albie Sachs, growing up in a secular Jewish family in Cape Town, internationalist, socialist in orientation, very urban, to meet Nelson Mandela, who'd grown up in a rural, traditional part of the Eastern Cape. We would never have met, but we didn't only meet, we became very close to each other. And the theme of my presentation now is how globalization produced its opposite, universalism. And the difference between the two, as I understand it, globalization starts in one part of the world, which then extends its hegemony to the rest of the world. Maybe extracting, exploiting the rest of the world, but imposing its values, its technology, its ways of seeing things on the rest of the world. It's a form of domination. Universalism is the universal human experiences in different parts of the world that gets distilled out to find certain things that characterize what it means to be a human being. It's affirmative. It's entrenched in the actual experiences of actual people expressing themselves. And in a sense, these are dialectical opposites, even enemies. And yet we live in a world where these enemies engage, they hate each other, they love each other, they try to destroy each other, and we are caught up in the middle of all that. Even this very conference, basically when you have a conference on globalization, it's to denounce globalization. But we take aeroplanes, we speak in English, we use electronic equipment, we're trapped in the very system that we're denouncing. And it's no good simply throwing up your hands. We have to learn to manage and live within that kind of a tension. But I think if you understand the tension, and you can at least tease out the conceptual, if you like, ideal systems, notions of the two, it becomes a little easier to manage. And if I extend the example now of the Defiance campaign, the whites come, extreme example of globalization, thinking they're bringing civilization with them and enlightenment with them. They conquer, they dispossess, they dominate, they make the indigenous peoples and populations subservient, quite literally. They force them to carry documents to live in their own country. They compel them to work as cheap labor. They destroy families. They seize the land. But they say it's all part of the civilizing mission. And then the resistance begins. And through the resistance, there's a human solidarity that transcends the racial divisions, the racist ideas. There's a reclaiming of humanity. But humanity is now being reclaimed not by a reversion to a pre-domination, pre-globalization setup, but through extracting, absorbing, turning around the swords into plowshares, if you like, the negativity into positivity, using maybe the English language, using a lot of the culture that's being imposed, but turning that inside out to get freedom and liberation. And I was just thinking back on the specifics. Our Defiance campaign, Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign, was modeled very much on the experience of Gandhi in South Africa, where he developed the notions of passive resistance. We didn't like the word passive resistance, it sounded too passive. So we called it the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. And people who'd been to jail with Gandhi took part in the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. And Gandhi would have been brought, the people, the community he served in South Africa were indentured Indian laborers after Britain had dominated the slave trade, again, a form of globalization that produced the abolitionist movement that brought people together in opposition to the idea of treating human beings as chattels, producing the counter idea of the essential humanity of every human being, that universal idea that nobody is born to be a slave, to be inferior to anybody else. That same Britain then that went to, once it had abolished slavery, send ships of war against other nations that continued. So imposing their global view that abolished slavery, but substituting it with indentured labor, bringing tens of thousands of people from India to work on the sugar plantations in South Africa. A small commercial class comes there. Gandhi comes out as an advocate, deeply immersed in Indian culture, tradition, spirituality, but he goes to London and he takes dancing lessons and learns French because he wants to be a qualified, smart barrister. He's invited to South Africa. The experience of being an Indian in South Africa turned MK Gandhi into Mahatma Gandhi, coming with a dapper suit and leaving with a dhoti. And a story that was told to me representing these tensions between the globalized and the universal when we were building our constitutional court on the site where Gandhi had been locked up. And a friend of mine, Indris Naidu, took a group of judges to look at that site, and he said his grandfather had gone to that prison with Gandhi, and at one stage, because they defied the laws then, at one stage the prison officials had said to the Indian prisoners, passive resistors, you must wear the same caps that the black African prisoners were wearing. And Indra said his grandfather objected. He said they want us to look like children. And Gandhi said no. If we want to understand how the most humble amongst us live, we must experience life as they live it. We will wear those caps and we will wear them with pride. And later that year, when he returned to India, he took that cap with him. And the Gandhi cap, in fact, was the cap that he took from the South African prison to India. It became the symbol of the Indian resistance movement. And to me, that's a beautiful example of that interpenetration between the globalization, the imposed, and the resistance to it, and how the resistance becomes internationalized and universalized. There was a time when a lot of opposition was being raised by people in Africa and Asia to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They were denouncing it as a Western notion being imposed upon us. And I had to think through what's going on here. Because the people doing that in Asia, they were saying, Asian values are different. We believe in the family, the collective unit, decisions are made in different ways. Don't impose your democracy on us. And these were the dictators. They were locking up their people. They were denying expression. And so they were representing the UNHDR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as an imposition on them, as though it was a globalizing, if you like, imposition. And yet for me, what was happening was just the opposite. The people in their countries then, it would be in Malaysia then, and in Singapore and so on, South Korea, they were fighting to express themselves, to overcome the autocracy, the military rule, the corruption, the violence. In Africa, again there was resistance to the Universal Declaration. People were saying, in Africa we believe in rule by consensus. So we don't have a division in the workplace with the bosses and the workers. We don't have trade unions. That all leads to conflict. We throw them into jail. We don't have opposition parties. We throw them into jail. And if they resist, we torture them. But it was the peoples of those countries who were trying to get their rights, their social and economic rights, their political rights, their freedom of expression. And then I thought, how did the Universal Declaration come about? It was a response to the extreme, most blatant, most unashamed form of globalization. The Nazi fascist expansion, the conquest, Japanese imperialism. It was globalized in the sense of almost all humanity was involved. Even Latin America sent troops to fight. North America sent troops to fight. Africa was colonized. Almost the whole of Asia was involved. And the response afterwards to the terrible atrocities and the violence that was used was to come up with the notion of universal human rights. And it wasn't simply the product of Churchill and Roosevelt. It was people who fought in resistance movements in occupied territories. It was the emergence of anti-racist notions. It was the destruction of that extreme, exaggerated form of sovereignty that you can do what you like, that war can only be countered by alliances, that there's no such thing as war being criminal in itself, aggression being criminal in itself. And so representatives of humane endeavors throughout the world, all continents being represented, came up with this notion of the Universal Declaration. And I think that's why it stood up so well. And one reason why we in South Africa, fighting for freedom in South Africa, we relied heavily on the Universal Declaration. We saw in it our aspirations, but also an instrument that would aid our liberation against oppressors in our country who were denied the universality, who insisted on exceptionalism, who saw whites as somehow being inherently superior to others and destined to rule. And we found reliance on these universal values extremely affirmative to achieve our sovereignty, our independence, our just occupation of the world, our existence as dignified human beings in our country. And so the greatest proponents of universalism were black people like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and Ahmed Kathrada from Indian origin and others. And seeing universalism in that sense as enabling oppressed South African people, the majority, to affirm themselves as South Africans with our languages, our culture, our ways of doing things, our capacity to sing, to move, to dance when we're expressing ourselves, very, very affirmatively. And that whole notion that democracy is not for Africa, that African culture, tradition, African mentality is opposed to democracy, we had to refute that, and we have refuted that. I'll say this now, the day after our president stepped down, not because there were tanks in the street, not because 1 million people came out to denounce the oppressors, but because of our Constitution. Our Constitution works because it taps into these universal principles and values, but in a sense adapts them, roots them in our culture, a spirit of Ubuntu that's very deep in African society, of human interdependence. I'm a person because you're a person. We're not all atoms colliding with each other, fighting for our own space and the right to be left alone. We are interdependent, and my humanity is advanced by recognizing your humanity, as yours is by recognizing mine. And somehow that is built into the very structure and nature and fabric of our constitutional order, but we have motions of no confidence in Parliament, very formal processes. We have elections that have been free and fair, that are meaningful. We have freedom of speech. We have social and economic rights in our Constitution. A whole range of things, all absolutely consonant with universally accepted values. Do we have to take a fatalistic view that the only way humane ideas can emerge and be developed is as an antidote to anti-humane ideas? It would be rather sad if that was so. And I was just thinking back, well, there has been another way. I'd call it the Marco Polo way. He didn't go with a gunboat. I'm not sure exactly how he traveled, but he went to China, and he went as an emissary. He was curious. He was well treated. He came back. Apparently some of the stories were not exactly true and just a tiny bit exaggerated. But nevertheless, he brought back the printing press. I'd say more for better than for worse, as far as Europe is concerned. He brought back gunpowder. It destroyed feudalism. It brought down the walls around the feudal baronial citadels of power, but at a terrible price, expanding capacity for war. He brought back the compass, which enabled people to travel all over the world. That's fine if they didn't take the gunpowder with them. He also brought back spaghetti, and he brought back ice cream. Now, if we could have a relationship between people and cultures and civilizations more based on the spaghetti and ice cream principle, then I think the tension between globalization, universalism would be much less than it is. But as it is at the moment, we have to live with the contradictions. We have to try to manage them as best we can. But it's very wonderful for me to be associated with the spirit and intent of this, our conversations today, and to feel that we are not simply denouncing globalization. We are trying to find ways to express human solidarity and contact that's very meaningful. And if we are using some of the mechanics of globalization in order to denounce globalization, let globalization suffer. Thank you.
Well, we have been discussing this problem for the last 50 years because we began it with sea law and with Arvid Pardo, that was the ambassador of Malta in the 70s in the United Nations, and he had a declaration that he managed to have approved by the General Assembly that said that the high sea should be used by present and future generations. And so you began to have the idea of a common heritage that has to be respected and that has to have a special legal framework. That means that it can only be used for peaceful ends, and that means that you can only use it in the sense that you cannot spend all the resources, but you have to save part of it. Then you had the Convention of Montego Bay on sea law that created an authority that would represent future generations when you are taking decisions within sea law in a certain sense. Then you reached the moon and you had another problem. What were you going to do with the moon? Could you buy a house in the moon? Could you use it for war purposes? And again, you had a problem of future generations. And again, you tried to solve it, but not very clearly. And then you had the human genome. And you had the possibility of mixing our DNA with the DNA of different species. And you had the possibility of enhancing the human animal. And you began to feel that the human animal was the direct object of science. So we were no longer studying the moon, but we were altering our genetic constitution. And the future generations had said nothing about it. And we can kill them or destroy them, or we can make them much better. It depends on the way you look at it. And again, who is going to represent them? And so you had different people speaking about it in different branches of law. You have Jacques Cousteau, that has a society and has a bill on the representation of future generations that tells us that in UNESCO we should always, when we are speaking about decisions of how to use water, of how to deal with the human genome, of how to use the high sea, if it is only the rich countries or also the poor countries, how are we going to do it? You should have someone that stands up and says, in this decision we should consider the interests of people who are going to be born in 500 years' time. But it has not been easy, and one sign that it has not been easy is that you only have soft law legal instruments. You have declarations, you have resolutions, but you do not have a convention on the rights of the future generations. And when you come to the national level, it is even more difficult in the sense that as they do not vote and politicians want to win elections, they tend to say before they win the elections, we will represent the future generations, we will have a national health system for the future generations that will be wonderful and so on. But once they are really representing humanity and each country, they tend to forget. And so what happens is that they are a silent minority. And what happens is you can say from a legal point of view, we are still discussing, why should we be responsible towards them from a technical point of view? Because you have a duty, you have towards a person that does not exist, towards humanity as an abstract concept, and you are responsible, but no one is going to control you really. So you can say, we can do it as we do it with minors, as we do it with disabled people. And I was listening to Richard and I was thinking about our convention, the United Nations Convention on people with, on disabled people with disabilities, that says in Article 203, everyone has the right to the recognition of his or her legal personality everywhere. So we are still in that level. Everyone has the right to be a subject standing before the law. And you could do it that way, or you could do it in the way we think about it when we speak about the rights of non-human animals. I can give legal personality to the big apes that are in our zoo, but if I do it, I have to have someone that represents them. But again, it's very difficult. They are a silent minority. They are almost invisible when it comes to really respecting their rights. And speaking about invisibility, I would like to ask Richard if he has ever thought about our detention camp in Tarrafal, because I have been in Cape Verde, and it is one of our silences in history. People there now live only 40 years time, or 45 years time. It's the lifespan when you are born. And when you ask them what has happened there, no one remembers. And I was listening to you, and I was thinking that the German people had detention camps for 5 or 6 years. But we, my country, and Professor Ian Pimentel has very well written and studied it, we have had detention camps for 30 years, always working and functioning. And that is a silence that has not been brought up. It has from the historical point of view, but speaking with the population and asking them, do you remember what really happened? And thank you.
Thank you. Let me go straight to the question on social development vis-a-vis economic development. Well, the present mindset is very much on the opposite side. There can be no social development without economic development, which is in fact true. But there can be no sustainable development of any kind if you don't take social rights into question. And we have plenty of examples. So I think the issue here is to how to find the right balance. And I don't think that's maybe it is a complicated issue, but I think at the outset, what is not present in most governments' decision-making is that it's not only a matter of not having enough resources, it's on how to generate more resources. We have this discussion very often with states who say you cannot allocate if you do not have resources. Certainly, but you can think of how to generate more resources. And that, in most countries of the so-called economically developed world, there's a lot of, a lot of opposition in terms of taxation systems. You hear a lot of the Tobin tax, for example, for years now, but it hasn't really progressed very much. So it's not a matter of putting one against the other, but first of all, it's a matter of being sure that one without the other is not possible. And I think that changes how you look at the balance for future generations. Take the right to Social Security. There's a lot of talk now that because we have very good pensions for the present pensioners, young people will be left out of the Social Security system altogether. I think that's a very convoluted kind of argument, which is not really true, because the problem with the present generations is that they will not build their right to Social Security because they have all these precarious work contracts, these very unfair working conditions. So it's not a matter of either pensions for these or pensions for those, but it's on how to make the system work in a way that is conducive to both. It's easier said than done, but I don't think that's been very much in the discussion, and it has not been very much in the mindset of the so-called developed countries. And if you look at developing countries, they are making very often better efforts to establish social protection flows, to start building from the social assistance programs they have in terms of trying to build a right. Whether we here in the economic developed countries, we kind of breaking whatever we had because of the argument that it's not financially sustainable in the long run. And I think we have yet to be assured that that is really true. And I am not assured of that. I would just like to, I know that this question for Richard about literature, I just want to give you my own personal understanding of Richard's book in Goa. I grew up in Goa. We studied the Inquisition, of course, like anyone else. But it was only when I read of the lived injustice it had created for one family, for one person, that is when I understood really what the Inquisition had been about. So I think there is a lot of power in bringing to the surface the lived injustices of people that suffer from these different inequalities, discriminations, in a way that history doesn't really portray, though you may study the phenomenon, but it doesn't come to you, it doesn't come home to you until you read of the lived injustice. That is what human rights is about. So I once again, I would like to thank Richard, because I had never understood the Inquisition in Goa in the way I did after I learned the history of Tiago Zarco, and which I think began with Bereki Isaac from The Last Kabbalist, but that's a different story. All right? Now, in terms of the investor-state dispute settlements, that was a question for the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but I can give you my take on what is happening in terms of the weakness of nation-states to regulate the power of national enterprises and mostly multinational enterprises. It's very difficult. It is a very complicated issue, but I think in part it stems from the exaggerated importance and value given to everything that's commercial. I know that speaking of the supremacy of human rights doesn't solve it all, but I think if the countries who have decision-making powers, be it in international financial institutions, be it in terms of donor countries, if they really took the human rights obligations to heart in their own territories and abroad, I think these issues related to multinational companies could be seen in a different light. We had the example of Ecuador, who had this major conflict and did win against one of the multinational companies, I fail to remember which. But the money the state of Ecuador spent on the legal conflict would have been much better used in terms of pursuing their right to education, their right to health, etc. And I think that kind of argument has not really been given a lot of weight, because in terms of the lateral investment courts, it's a given that the multinational companies have good lawyers, they have exceptionally well-trained legal mindsets, and therefore it's easy for them to win. So once again, I think it's coming back to what human rights is all about, that it's not really something that is invented in any one part of the world, but that it is there because it is your right as a human. I have some training for small children, 10 to 12 age brackets, on human rights. And when we do the role plays with them, the biggest and the greatest reassurance I've had is one little boy who's come to me and said, "So this is what human rights is all about. We had been taught things like this, but this is about everyday life." And something that's about everyday life can never belong to one region or to one country. It belongs to humankind as a whole, and it's very much grounded in what your lived injustice have been. Thank you. That was not for me, the question, but I just thought I'd said something.
The questions are for everybody.
Thank you very much. What to do with the perpetrators, that I do not dare really. I do not dare really speak, because soft vengeance is, I think, all about what to do with the perpetrators, and having Albie Sachs on the panel has completely destroyed any aspiration I might have about talking about perpetrators. Thank you.
My turn? Okay, quickly, because we don't have that much time. I'd like to thank Virginia again. I'm absolutely overwhelmed with everybody's kindness toward me and the books. And I think she touched on a really important point, and why novels are important. We live in an anti-cultural environment to some extent in Europe with neoliberalism, and in America. And I think it's important to talk about why art, books, ballet, dance, music, it's so important to us. In the case of books, I do a lot of talks about the Holocaust and Judaism because I'm a Jew in Portugal and there are very few of us. And so I'm invited all the time. And when I talk about the Holocaust, you know, we mention 6 million Jewish dead and 500,000 gypsies, and we give all these numbers, and that's really important to give an idea of the dimension of the crime. But no statistic will ever transmit an emotion. And so one of the things I do when I talk to young people in particular is I say, don't feel guilty for not being upset about 6 million Jewish dead. I'm not upset either. 6 million means nothing to me. I mean, it means something, but it doesn't inspire anger, a need for vengeance, sadness. It doesn't. The only way to do that is to form a relationship somehow with someone who has suffered in the Holocaust. It can be mean reading Anne Frank, Primo Levi, or it can mean reading a novel of mine or someone else. By engaging with the characters in a wonderfully written novel over the course of 20 hours, we form a relationship with those characters. And when they suffer in a concentration camp, we feel it. And I think that's one of the hopes we have for ending these crimes against humanity, is forming a relationship with the people who've already suffered. Tarrafal in Portugal. You know, Portugal, I live in Portugal for 27 years, and I owe a lot to this country, and it's been great to me. One of the problems we have in Portugal is, I don't know why, but we have yet to develop cultural products, books, films, that deal with the crimes committed here. There are very few novelists who write about the wars in Africa. Almost none who write about PID, the secret police, and what they did. Who write about these camps. I don't understand it. Coming from America, where we, you know, write about the war in Vietnam, we make movies about it. Maybe not enough, but in Portugal, there's almost this terrible, terrifying silence when it comes to what we've lived through, and I don't understand it. So hopefully a new generation will write about these topics. Francesca discussed a lot of things. One of them, you know, the presence of Yiddish culture in America points up a paradox about the United States that's very hard even for Americans to understand. We have a culture that absorbs difference and immigration and different cultures extremely well. You know, these people from Cambodia and South Africa and Australia and Peru who come to America and who are proud to be Americans, who love to participate. That's something, I wouldn't say uniquely American, but especially good in America, that we value that. And yet at the same time, we still have xenophobic monsters running around our country, including the President of the United States. It's a huge paradox. I can't explain it. It brings up two other topics very quickly about the United States that are very important for the rest of the world. Urban versus rural. If you look at the election in the United States, rural areas all voted for Donald Trump, urban areas all voted for Hillary Clinton. This is a war that's going to be more and more prominent everywhere in the planet. I remember going to Istanbul about 10 years ago, and they had just elected a fundamentalist Muslim mayor. And my friends in Istanbul are, you know, secular Muslims and these really forward-thinking women, and, you know, they're great. And I'm like, how was this possible? And they tell me, we've had immigration of 9 million people, rural people from the rest of Turkey who've come and are living in Istanbul. So my friends, the secular, democratic, amazing, progressive people who live in Istanbul are now a very small minority. And that battle is taking place all over the world, including the United States. The other uniquely American phenomenon, maybe not uniquely, but it doesn't exist so much in Europe, is an incredible anti-intellectual culture. Yes, you can be an intellectual, but don't show it. Why does Barack Obama have to play basketball? And because to prove he's just a regular guy like everybody else. And George Bush is going to go hunting. And even professors at Harvard, Yale, Duke, Stanford, they have to prove, if they talk in the public sphere, that they're just regular guys. You know, they're going to watch the Super Bowl too and drink Budweiser beer. Because being an intellectual in America is a negative thing. And as long as we have that in the United States, we're going to continue to elect anti-intellectual presidents like Donald Trump. And so America is a country of paradoxes. The second part of the question was harder to talk about. How do I write, or how do novelists write about people who are very different from us? How do I write about a bushman from South Africa in the 19th century? The only way I can do it is by being honest and with good faith, and by reading everything I can about Bushmen, their culture, their music, their mythology, their religion, their ways of hunting, everything I can, and absorbing that. It's a trick. It's like being an actor. How does Meryl Streep play a Polish woman in the Holocaust in 1942? You have to somehow find a way to enter the skin of somebody else. And that's what I spend my days doing. I develop my imagination just to be able to do that. And it's a form of universalism, because it's based on the idea that, yes, ancient Greeks were very different from me, but we also had an enormous amount in common. We wanted to be loved. We wanted to be surrounded by compassion. We wanted to find good work. We wanted our kids to be happy. You know, there's an enormous list of things that we all have in common, and that's what a novelist uses. Nations founded on amnesia. Unfortunately, that's true. But the problem here, and maybe a certain amount is necessary, as you said, but one of the biggest problems is karma. When you are founded on amnesia, it's going to come back and get you. And I see Donald Trump as America's karma, because for decades now, we have refused to teach adequately about the history of immigration in America, the history of colonization in America, the contributions made by women, by blacks, by everybody to the United States. People growing up in the United States know nothing about those things now, or extremely little. And it's come back to haunt us, because now we have Donald Trump and an entire political party, the Republican Party, that bases its policies on racism and xenophobia and homophobia and all the worst traits of American culture. So it's an extreme danger. And I'm going to risk talking about perpetrators with Albie here only for one moment, to say that human beings are think symbolically. To give you a very brief example and a superficial example, when you have a minister in a poor country who wears Versace suits and drives around with a chauffeur in a Mercedes and stays at 5-star hotels in London and Paris, maybe that's not so important for the budget of a country, him spending $5,000 a night in a hotel. But symbolically, people think this is unjust. I can't trust this person. Our class of politicians is betraying us. And politicians forget that we think symbolically. And the fact, when perpetrators like the PIDE in Portugal are never put on trial, or at least never faced face to face by their victims to tell their stories, when that doesn't happen, what the consequence is, you grow up in a culture of people who think the system of justice doesn't work here. And that is, in fact, despite what the judges in Portugal say, that is what most people in Portugal think. It's impossible to achieve justice in this country unless you know the right people. And that is extremely dangerous, because it creates a culture in which people don't want to participate in society. How many times have I heard, Richard, don't bother writing about these things. Don't bother talking about discrimination. It's not worth it, because it's never going to change. People will never do anything about it. We have this culture of defeatism in Portugal, of passivity, in part because we don't believe in the system of justice. And I believe that that's a direct consequence of never confronting the perpetrators with what they've done.
It's interesting that two lawyers here, in a way, expressed a little bit of skepticism about law. And I think I've got a generous answer. It's not to say law is insignificant or not enough or over-pretentious. It's to expand the notion of law. It's a rule of law, it's a set of procedures. You do things correctly, but that's not enough. Law must have imagination, it must have empathy. One American judge whom I admire very much, Brennan, said that law is involved in reason and passion, both being involved. And passion, by passion he meant compassion, empathy. And I think that's the way in which one enlarges the vision of law. And that's where the social and economic rights become so important, because human beings live in their bodies, in their minds are attached to the bodies directed by a mind. We used to say we're not fighting for freedom without bread, we're not fighting for bread without freedom, we want freedom and bread. And when I went to a little museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, where it's famous because American women had the first strike in that little town, they said we're fighting for bread and roses. And I like that. So we're fighting for freedom, for bread and for roses, because people have a right not only to things and not to be oppressed, but they have a right to beauty and imagination and exploration. In terms of the nation, perpetrators and amnesia, I'm going to link all three of these in terms of, in a way, our Truth Commission process. It's not just amnesia. Sometimes I'm not sure if it's worse to have amnesia or to have separate memories that don't connect up with each other. But if we'd had a white memory, young people growing up with a white memory and vision into the future of how our country was created and what life was like, and then a totally different black one, then we have a constitution that says we're all equals, but we are living in different universes. And our Truth Commission played a huge role in establishing a kind of a narrative. And that was done not through the report, as has been pointed out here, not through the document. Nobody reads the report. It's a beautifully written report. But through remembering the stories that were told when precisely what you mentioned happened. We didn't follow the route of punishment. We followed the route of telling the truth. If you told the truth, then you would be free from prosecution. But that meant you had to come out, at least not every bit of the truth, but enough of the truth to then claim a right to citizenship without being sent to jail for what you've done in the past. And that was important for us. I remember the debates we had about what does it mean to have a nation. And Habermas's views received quite a lot of prominence at that time. Is the nation a body that has ancient roots in the collective memory and experience of a particular group of people identified as such? And he rejected that, the idea of a German, almost a German DNA, political, social, cultural DNA, now transcending and going into future generations. And he said what makes us a nation today is our constitutional patriotism, the fact that we are free, that we are equal, that we converse, that we respect each other, and that's what characterizes the nation. And for us it was important to have a nation because apartheid denied nationality. Apartheid saw ethnic groups existing maybe in a common territory, but they wanted a whole vision of power sharing between racial groups. It would have been a total disaster in South Africa, and only when we insisted on common humanity and a Bill of Rights that protected people not because they were black or white or majority or minority, because they were human beings, then we could start getting a nation. And right now we have the project, we're building a museum of the Constitution, how we made the Constitution, and an archive on Constitution Hill, right in the heart of the jail. I always say we South Africans have the honor of having the only jail in the world where both Gandhi and Mandela were locked up. That's where our Constitutional Court is. That's where we are going to put the site of the archive and the museum. But how to tell that story? It's a story of triumph, but we want to tell it in a non-triumphalist way. And the questions we're asking ourselves of how do we represent our past in a way that it's not a cut and dried set, learn a catechism, that is our past. That's the main project that's facing us there. In terms of technology, I wouldn't say technology in itself is a new form of imperialism. Technology can oppress and technology can liberate. And we find this very much now in the whole area, for example, of energy creation, and a terrific thrust towards using the wind and using the sun as a source of renewable energy, not just because it's renewable, but it's less polluting, it's less drastic, and I think one has to not reject technology, but to embrace technology to ensure that it is used in a way that is respectful of the earth, of people, doesn't dominate people's lives, and becomes emancipatory. Finally, how were people brought in the making of the Constitution? Initially, many of us said, fantastic, for the first time, people's voices are going to be heard, we're going to make the Constitution jointly. Everybody's got to be there. The trade unions, the employers' organizations, faith communities, they must all be there. And then we decided, no, then that becomes a mass meeting. And you need very focused minds on the core, if you like, the core technology of the Constitution. We didn't want people shouting each other down. So we started off then with mainly experts, political, although some of the best negotiators were not lawyers at all. One was a pharmacist. He was brilliant. Another was a mathematician. He was brilliant. Another was a reverend who'd been a captain of the South African rugby team. And he just turned out to have a knack of getting people to agree, become a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. He just had that particular knack. So at first it was a very relatively small selected group of people who worked on the processes. And the key thing we did to validate and legitimize the whole constitution making was to say only an elected body with a mandate from the people can draft a constitution that will be lasting. And that meant we self-selected people used a two-stage process. We forced the other side ultimately to agree to have a national elections for the first time, everybody voting as equals. And the big issues then were what kind of constitution do we want, what kind of country do we envisage. Then it was the parliament that drafted the final constitution, but we'd agreed to certain key principles in advance that would have to be included. And I'm sitting on the Constitutional Court. I actually was one of 11 judges who declared our constitution to be unconstitutional. We had to invent that kind of process and that hypothesis because the text that was drafted by the Parliament sitting as a constitution-making body in 9 respects did not conform to the principles agreed to in advance. Overwhelmingly it conformed, but in 9 respects it didn't do so. We sent it back. We declared it to be unconstitutional. Now, in the process of Parliament functioning, they went out to the people, and they had groups that would go out into the communities, and they would raise issues. It was everything. We had also a very good television program. It was called Future Imperfect. And they would get the leaders of the different parties, representatives, to speak. Your position on capital punishment, on gay rights, on federalism, on proportional representation versus single-member constituencies. All of these things were debated. And they found these political representatives, if you came there with a heavy, long monologue, you got nowhere. You've got to be quick and smart and funny and humane on television. So it forced them to now translate these abstract ideas into, if you like, sound bites, but convincing sound bites. And you can only get a convincing soundbite if you've done a bit of research and thinking to know what it is that's going to press the right buttons. So that also meant people felt involved in the constitution-making process. It wasn't just a right given to them that they ought to have. They felt this is our constitution. And the result is that the constitution today has become very significant in terms of nation creation. It's not just a product of a national endeavor, it's the foundations of our nation, a nation where people have different origins, different appearances, different languages, taste, culture, what binds them. The cement is the notion of that shared patriotism through constitutional rights, fundamental rights. And so far, it's working. And it's actually wonderful to see, a wonderful affirmation, if you like, of the universality of certain basic key ideas of human dignity, of the right to speak, the duty to listen, having empathy, seeing rights in a very broad way, the indivisibility of not only the freedom rights, not only the bread rights, but also the green rights, the rights of culture. All of these things playing out very, very strongly in South Africa today. And we become remarkable. We abolish capital punishment because it's inconsistent with our Bill of Rights. We strike down sodomy as a crime. Shortly after, in South Africa, that's so autocratic and homophobic, and our constitution makes it possible to strike down sodomy as a crime. And then afterwards I was given, it was a very beautiful task given to me to write the judgment requiring same-sex marriages to be recognized, and that was in 2005, how many years ahead of the United States. So the first will be the last will be the first. And we seem to leap very quickly, maybe in 1 week, from being the first to being the last, and back to being the first, and back to being the last. It makes us all a little bit dizzy. It's very exciting for living, and all the tensions that we've been discussing on the platform are played out in spades in our country, but it's great to be alive there now.
Like somebody was saying yesterday, or Albie was quoting somebody, he's such a waste of a good Christian. And I have been asked, well, I thank, first of all, Helena, Virginia, Albie, and Richard, and all of you who've been here and made comments and asked questions or just listened attentively. And somebody asked me to tell you that we are having lunch downstairs in this building.
I think so.
That's the message I got. So there you are. See you in a minute.